Schiller embodied the American dream. He came from Colombia with nothing, and through a lot of hard work and dedication, became a multi-millionaire. But if he knew what was in store for him on this day, his ass would have probably stayed in Colombia. For the past few months, Schiller has been stalked by a group of bodybuilding ninjas, and they want his money. At around 4 p.m., the ninjas would kidnap Schiller from outside his business and spend the next 30 days beating, torturing, and humiliating him. To make the pain stop, Schiller agreed to give the psychopaths everything he owned. And how did they thank him? By setting him on fire and running him over with a car twice. Miraculously, he survived. But unfortunately for the gang's next two victims, they wouldn't be so lucky. If this sounds familiar, it's because the movie Pain and Gain was based on these events, but the real life story is much more insane than that dog shit film. This is the story of the Sun Gym Gang. Sun Gym Gang. It's kind of a hard one to say. At its core, this is a tale of greed and envy. And what better place to set our story than Miami? A breeding ground for all sorts of degenerates, grifters, and lowlifes. It's only in a city like Miami that a place like Sun Gym could exist. Now, this was no regular gym. It was a seedy place whose clientele mostly consisted of crooked cops, roid junkies, and felons, with a lot of overlap. According to one Miami police officer, I could meet my monthly quota of felony arrests in one night at Sun Gym. And the only people more psychotic than the gym's patrons were its employees. Which brings me to the first member of our criminal enterprise, Danny Lugo, Sun Gym's general manager, personal trainer, and the leader of its namesake gang. In Pain and Gain, Danny Lugo was portrayed by Mark Wahlberg as this sort of like goofy guy with a lot of big ideas. In reality though, the guy was a unhinged psychopath, but he wasn't always like that. Danny grew up in the Bronx sharing a small apartment with his parents and 3 siblings. But from an early age, the kid showed a lot of potential. He was an honors student, star football player, and even an altar boy at church. After high school, he got a full-ride scholarship to Furton University. Now, it's extremely ironic because going to college was supposed to allow Danny to escape from a life of poverty and crime, but instead, it kicked off his criminal life. You see, most of his classmates were rich trust fund brats who drove sports cars, wore Rolexes, and partied on yachts. Meanwhile, Lugo rode the bus to campus from his shitty rat-infested apartment. This made Lugo insanely jealous. In his head, he was this, like, super genius ubermensch. So why wasn't he living the extravagant lifestyle like the rest of these schmucks? So in his senior year, Danny decided that he would get rich, no matter what. Even if that meant he had to lie, cheat, steal, even kill. So in his senior year, he dropped out of college and became a full-time con man. Lugo's first grift was pretending to be a wealthy financier. He sought out small business owners who needed a loan, which he would offer them in exchange for a 10% down payment. Except they never got the loan, and he pocketed the money. He made over $300,000 running this scheme. But the guy wasn't good at covering his tracks, so it didn't take the FBI long to bust his ass. During his trial, Lugo gave this humble statement: "It will never happen again, for I have learned not to use my intelligence for wrong actions." He would spend the next 2 years in federal prison. When Lugo got out, one of the conditions of his parole was that he needed to get a job. But no establishment wanted to hire a convicted felon. Well, except for one. Lugo convinced Sun Gym's owner, John Meese, that he would double their membership in 6 months. Now, Sun Gym was struggling financially at the time, so Meese decided to take a chance on Lugo despite his criminal past. That's how Danny ended up as the manager. But this begs one question: how does one go from scamming and running a gym to kidnapping, extortion, and murder? Well, this whole sequence of events was kicked off when Lugo started personally training this guy, Jorge Delgado. The two of them immediately hit it off and became best friends. During their training sessions, Delgado would go on and on about this guy Marc Schiller, who you might remember from the intro of this video. Remember they kidnapped him? Schiller was almost like a father figure to Jorge. He found him when he was a broke loser and took him under his wing. Marc gave him a job at his accounting firm, but eventually the two of them would become close friends and business partners. He was at the house almost every day. He knew every nuance of our lives. We went on vacation, he took care of the house. I trusted him completely and had no reason not to. Well, believe me when I say Jorge would give him a reason. And that reason was Danny Lugo. These two were more inseparable than Siamese twins, which was a real pain in the ass for Marc Schiller. You see, he never liked Lugo. From the very start, he had him pegged as a dangerous con man. This put a huge strain on Marc's relationship with Delgado, and to make matters worse, Lugo's personality was rubbing off on Jorge. The guy was turning into a real jerk. He was soft-spoken, and I never saw him mad or frustrated. In a short period of time, Jorge had transformed into a person I did not know. Marc couldn't take it anymore. The final straw was when Delgado demanded that Lugo be made a partner in their business. Schiller understandably crashed out. He said he would rather be strapped into a chair and beat for a month straight than ever work with Danny Lugo. Kind of paraphrasing there. It was at that moment that Marc Schiller decided to cut all personal and financial ties with his former protege. This was terrible news for Delgado because the guy was kind of incompetent, and the only reason he even reached some level of success was because of Schiller's business savvy. Without him, he was cooked. Oh, and to make matters worse, his wife was pregnant. But one man's despair is another's opportunity. After the falling out, Danny Lugo started getting into Delgado's head. He used his silver tongue to convince Jorge that Marc Schiller was an evil man who had been taking advantage of him and stealing from him for years, and it was time for payback. That's when Lugo came up with a brilliant idea. Why don't we just take Schiller's money and put it into our bank accounts? But how would they do that? Simple. KTS. Kidnap, torture, sign. They would kidnap Schiller, torture him into submission, and finally force him to sign his assets over. Jorge was reluctant to do that to his former mentor. I mean, yeah, the guy fucked him over, but this was a bit extreme. But as we'll come to find out, Danny had cult leader levels of charisma, so eventually Delgado got on board. The next member of our gang didn't need much persuading at all. Adrian Doorbal was a poor kid from Trinidad who came to Miami to escape the crippling poverty of his childhood. He grew up an orphan and was desperate for a father figure. Fortunately for him, the father he found was Danny Lugo. Lugo found Doorbal when he was a skinny, broke 19-year-old kid. He gave him a job and started plying him full of steroids, transforming Doorbal into a big, dumb, roid-addicted henchman who was completely loyal to Lugo. He had all his stat points in strength and none in intellect. The guy was basically a golem. Lugo approached Doorbal and gave him the whole spiel about this evil rich man who stole money from Delgado and blah blah blah. Adrian was in right away. He shared Danny's contempt for rich people, plus he would do anything Lugo asked, even kill. Alright, so we got the brains and we got the muscle, but we're still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Schiller couldn't just sign over his assets, they needed to go through a notary. That's where the final member of the crew comes in. John Carl Meese. Apart from being Sun Gym's owner, he was also a certified public accountant, meaning he could notarize any business transaction and make it look legit, even one signed under duress. Now, normally Meese wouldn't get himself tangled up in these illegal shenanigans, but the guy was desperate for a cash injection. The guy had made a lot of money running his own accounting firm, but that was just a way for him to fund his real passion, bodybuilding. He loved watching sweaty, greased up men flex. And that's why he opened up Sun Gym in the first place. He envisioned it kind of like a reverse Planet Fitness where only the most serious bodybuilders would hang out. But there was one problem. The place was hemorrhaging money, just like my joint bank account I shared with my ex-wife. Like I mentioned, the place had a bit of a seedy reputation, so most normal people opted to go elsewhere. Despite it being a massive financial liability, Meese couldn't bear to close Sun Gym down. So when Lugo came in offering him $200K to notarize a few documents, he was sold. Now keep in mind there were more people involved, about a dozen total, but for the sake of brevity, we'll focus on these 4 guys. Okay, so now that we got the whole gang together, they needed to figure out how they were actually going to kidnap Schiller. Danny Lugo, as always, came up with a 200 IQ play. Doorbal, Lugo, and 2 other goons would dress up like ninjas and go to Schiller's house on Halloween. Pretending to be trick-or-treaters, the 6-foot-tall bodybuilders would ring the doorbell and kidnap Schiller when he answered. Everyone agreed. The plan was brilliant. The next day, the gang went to a spy shop and bought tasers, night vision goggles, walkie-talkies, and all the other essentials for a special Black Ops mission like this. Next, they rented a minivan so they could stake out Schiller's place without attracting too much attention. A week later on Halloween, it was time to put the plan in action. But the gang was forced to abort when Danny got drunk at the strip club and decided he was having too much fun to leave. Honestly, probably for the best. That plan was pretty dumb. Almost as dumb as not using a VPN. Luckily, I'm smart, and that's why I partnered with Surfshark on this video. I travel a lot, and I often find myself connecting to public Wi-Fi networks. Now, getting on public Wi-Fi without protection is kind of like doing other things without protection, okay? It's not worth the risk, trust me. Surfshark VPN encrypts your IP address and makes it harder for hackers to take your data. And it doesn't stop there. Surfshark also has their own antivirus, ad-free search engine, and an alert system that notifies you if any of your passwords or information was compromised. That's like 4 things in one. These days, you're lucky if you get 1 thing in one. So use my code Dantavius or go to surfshark.com/Dantavius for an extra 4 months. Surfshark is so confident that you'll be satisfied. They even have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, Surfshark, for sponsoring this video. Okay, where was I? Oh, that's right, the Halloween ninja scheme didn't quite pan out. No problem, Lugo had a plan B. He always had a plan B. The gang realized that Schiller was a creature of habit. He always got the paper at the same time every morning before driving to the Schlotsky's Deli franchise that he owned. So, a week after Halloween, in the early morning hours, the gang was hiding in the bushes in front of his house. Lugo insisted on rocking the ninja outfits again, along with the black face paint. Seriously? Blackface? Kidnapping and extortion, I understand, but I draw the line at racism. As soon as Schiller came out to get the paper, he would be grabbed and thrown into the van. But their plot was thwarted again when a early morning jogger spawned in and saw them. There were, and I'm not joking, 6 more failed attempts after this, each one more stupid than the last. Getting Schiller was proving to be way more difficult than anyone anticipated. The gang's morale was in the toilet. But Danny Lugo didn't give up hope. He called a meeting at Solid Gold, their favorite strip club, and gave the boys a pep talk.
Are we really gonna let this rich fuck get away? If we pull this off, we'd have way more than enough money to party with any girl in here.
The speech was a resounding success. This guy was like Winston Churchill if he was addicted to steroids instead of alcohol. With a renewed sense of purpose, the gang cooked up another scheme. This time, things would be different. November 15th, 1994. Lugo and the boys were waiting outside the Schlotsky's. Here was the plan. Schiller always parked in the back alley behind the building. Lugo was in his car blocking one side of the alley. When Marc got in his car, Lugo would radio Doorbal, who was waiting around the corner, who would pull up the van and block the other exit. Schiller would be a sitting duck. At around 9 a.m., Marc finally emerged. Lugo radioed Doorbal as planned.
Target acquired. Pull up.
No answer.
I said pull up, now!
Schiller had no idea that it was him blocking his path, so he started honking at him.
Come on, man, he's gonna get away!
Schiller, frustrated, put his car in reverse and backed out of the alley. A few seconds later, Doorbal finally responded.
This fucking thing won't start.
This time, Danny Lugo was pissed. He called the rest of the gang a bunch of incompetent fuck-ups and said he was out. If they wanted to get Schiller, they would be on their own. This really upset Doorbal, who would do anything to impress Lugo. And what better way to impress him than to finally get Marc Schiller? So Doorbal cooked up a plan of his own. No fancy spy equipment or ninja getup necessary. Doorbal decided to switch up the crew a little bit, so he benched one of the henchmen and grabbed another one from the gym. So he took the 2 guys and went back to Schlotsky's and waited. This time, no matter what happened, he wasn't leaving empty-handed. 4:15 p.m. Once again, Schiller exited Schlotsky's through the back and got into his car. The crew didn't waste any time. Doorbal and another goon bum-rushed Schiller and grabbed him from behind. They thought Schiller was gonna be an easy target. After all, these guys were massive bodybuilders and he was some middle-aged Jewish guy. But as we'll come to find out, Marc Schiller is a tough bastard, and he wasn't gonna go out without a fight. He held on to the steering wheel tighter than I hold on to hope that my dad will return home one day. The bodybuilders struggled with him for several minutes, and to make things even more chaotic, Schiller was screaming the whole time, "Help me! Help!" His screams were cut short by a sudden jolt of electricity running through his body. He had just been tased. But not even 120,000 volts could make this guy let go of that steering wheel. So they hit him again. This time, the pain was so excruciating, he finally let go. Doorbal then dragged him back to the van. Now, I just gotta say, this plan should not have worked. They grabbed this guy in broad daylight from a busy shopping center while he was screaming his ass off. But it worked. Doorbal drove while the other 2 thugs beat the absolute crap out of Schiller. Tasing, punching, even f***ing. Wait, why was that censored? I just said f***ing. The fuck? Wait, fuck isn't censored? They kicked me repeatedly in the ribs, punched me in the face and body, all while laughing loudly. The beating continued for well over half an hour until the van finally reached its destination, an empty warehouse in the middle of nowhere. Unfortunately for Marc Schiller, the pain he had experienced up to this point, that was only the beginning of... Meanwhile, Danny Lugo was at the strip club getting a lap dance, and all of a sudden he felt something in his pants. It was his cell phone. Adrian Doorbal was calling. "The Eagle has landed. I have a present for you," he said. Lugo sat there for a second. "Eagle has landed? What the heck does..." Oh. When Lugo realized what the present was, he was so excited he didn't even finish his lap dance and rushed to the warehouse. When he arrived, his gift was waiting for him wrapped in duct tape and handcuffed to a chair. Lugo and the rest of the crew exchanged high fives, and then they left. They went back to the strip club to celebrate. These guys spent a ridiculous amount of time in the strip club. Or maybe I'm just gay, I don't know. Schiller was left alone for several hours, and he spent most of that time trying to figure out who was doing this to him and why. And it wouldn't be long until he got the answer to that second question. When Lugo returned after 7 hours, he demanded that Schiller sign over all his assets and possessions, including his house, businesses, and most importantly, his offshore bank account. When he refused, the gang spent the next few hours the absolute dog shit out of him. And this wasn't just business, by the way. These psychos got pleasure out of Schiller's misery. Quote, "He was zapped with a taser and pistol whipped. When Schiller asked for a cigarette, he was burned on his hands and knuckles. His captors just laughed. They even burned him with his own lighter, searing his arms and burning the hair on his chest. The thugs found that funny too." To add insult to injury, they wouldn't even let him use the bathroom, forcing him to relieve himself in his pants. After the gang had their fun with Schiller, things got serious. Well, more serious. Lugo told Schiller that if he didn't cooperate, they would kidnap his wife and take turns raping her in front of him. Okay, wow, I'm starting to think these guys aren't so chill. Schiller had no choice. He told them that he would give them whatever they wanted on the condition that his family be allowed to go back to Colombia, which Lugo agreed to. So, with a gun pointed at his head, Schiller called his wife and told her to get on the first flight to Colombia and not to go to the police under any circumstances. Once his family was safely out of the country, Schiller was handed a giant stack of documents to autograph. Now, keep in mind, his eyes were covered in duct tape this whole time, so he had no idea what he was signing. But even though Schiller was blind, he wasn't stupid. It took him a while, but he finally figured out who was behind all this. The only person on the planet, other than his wife, who knew about the offshore accounts was Jorge Delgado. And if Delgado was involved, that means that Danny Lugo was probably the mastermind. Marc couldn't believe it. After everything he did for this schmuck, he goes and stabs him in the back. But that information was pretty useless for now. I mean, the dude was strapped in a chair covered in duct tape and his own feces. He wasn't exactly in a position to act. So, Schiller did the only thing he could, signed away everything he worked his entire life for. The papers were then taken to John Meese, who put his stamp on the documents, certifying that all these transactions were legitimate. When it was all said and done, the Sun Gym gang made out with about $4.5 million. But it wasn't time to celebrate yet, because what the hell were they going to do with Schiller? They couldn't just let the guy go or he might run to the cops. It was clear that there was only one solution. They had to whack Marc. Now, the easy thing to do would chop up his body and dump him in the Everglades, but Schiller had a $2 million life insurance policy, which now belonged to the gang. If they were gonna get that money, they had to make it look like an accident. It's time for another one of Danny Lugo's iconic schemes. They would make it seem like Schiller was on a drunken bender that ended in a fatal car crash. To make it seem believable, Danny forced Schiller to call up his friends and business associates and tell them that he was leaving his family to run away with some big booty Latina, and that was the reason he liquidated all his cash. On the third day, Schiller was placed in the driver's seat of his car. Lugo, who was sitting in the passenger seat, reached his foot over and floored the gas, aiming the car at a concrete pole. He then jumped out right before the car made impact. Surprisingly, Schiller survived. Unconscious, but still alive. But that's okay, because Lugo anticipated this. The gang doused the car in gas and set it on fire. No way anybody's coming out of that alive. So, imagine their surprise when Schiller just casually walked out of the burning vehicle. Unbelievable, this guy was like fucking Rasputin. At this point, the boys were getting frustrated, so one of them ran Schiller over with the van, and then backed it over him for good measure. The gang then sped off before any witnesses could show up and congratulated each other on a job well done. It was time to celebrate a solid goal. But there was just one problem. 2 days later, Lugo and the boys were kicking their feet up at Marc Schiller's mansion. Danny was flipping through the local paper looking for Schiller's obituary. There was nothing. So he called the local morgue. Also nothing. Was it possible that Marc survived? No. The guy had enough booze in his body to take down a kangaroo. He had been sleep deprived, starved, beaten for a month, and to top it all off, hit with a car twice. There was no way anybody could have survived all that. But just to make sure, Lugo called the nearest hospital. No fucking way. On December 15th, 1994, Marc Schiller woke up at Jackson Memorial Hospital. He had broken several bones, 90% of his body was covered in bandages, and the other 10 had tubes coming out of it. His bladder and spleen had both ruptured, and he had to undergo emergency surgery to save his life. Doctors told him he would likely be permanently paralyzed. But he was alive. Schiller tried to explain that he'd been kidnapped by a group of bodybuilders who stole his house before getting him drunk and forcing him to crash his car. But obviously, out of context, that sounds ridiculous, so the hospital staff wrote him off as another alcoholic schizo on a bender. It was Miami, after all. This was probably like not even the third craziest story they heard that day. Schiller figured that if the hospital staff didn't believe him, the police probably wouldn't either. So he reached out to a private investigator instead. But not just any private investigator, the best damn PI east of the Mississippi, Ed Dubois. We'll come back to him in a minute. When Danny Lugo found out that Schiller was alive, he was livid. He called the rest of the gang together and told them they had to finish the mother sucker off once and for all. Doorbal volunteered to strangle Schiller with a pillow while Lugo staged a fistfight in the hallway as a distraction. Yet another foolproof plan. So the two of them, along with this guy Carl Weeks, went to the hospital to execute Schiller, but the geniuses got lost in the maze of hallways. By the time they found Schiller's room, he was already gone. Bro was on a plane halfway to New York. Ed Dubois gave Marc Schiller the best advice of his life. Get the fuck out of Miami as soon as possible. Right after hanging up the phone with Dubois, Schiller got airlifted to New York, where he would lay low until he recovered. Meanwhile, Ed Dubois was on the case. Schiller faxed Ed over the documents that he allegedly signed. Dubois saw that they were notarized by one John Carl Meese. And wouldn't you know it, Ed just happened to know Meese. In fact, the two of them had known each other for almost 30 years. Ed was starting to doubt Schiller's story now. The John Meese he knew was an upstanding citizen, a pillar of the community. But it was his only lead, so he decided to confront his pal anyways. When Ed walked into his office, Meese greeted him with a shit-eating smile on his face. But that grin would disappear when Dubois said,
"I'm here representing a client named Marc Schiller. Ever heard of him?"
I don't recognize that name,
Meese said, as a bead of sweat rolled down his face. Ed pulled out the documents showing Meese's stamp next to Schiller's signature, but Meese brushed it off and insisted he didn't remember.
Ed, I'm a notary. I notarize things all day long. And, you know, all these Latins look alike to me.
Meese also downplayed his relationship with Lugo and Delgado, but offered to set up a meeting with the four of them to straighten things out. Ed agreed. Dubois walked into the building skeptical, but walked out 100% convinced that Marc Schiller was telling the truth. Now, he just needed to prove it. When word got around to the rest of the gang that a PI was poking around, they started freaking out. A few days later, Ed showed up to the meeting, but no sign of Lugo. It was just him and Delgado. To Ed's surprise, Delgado made Schiller an offer. The gang would pay him back $1.2 million. In exchange, Schiller would have to sign a contract promising to never speak to anyone about the whole kidnapping thing, especially not the police. Ed was stunned at how stupid these guys were. Schiller and Dubois obviously knew that this contract was more worthless than my DeVry degree, but they thought they might at least get some of the money back before going to the police. So they agreed to the terms. But then, Danny Lugo, genius businessman, tried to pull a fast one. He changed the $sign on the contract to an Italian lira symbol, meaning he would only have to pay Schiller about $1,200 in real money. This tomfoolery would go on for weeks. Ed would meet with the gang, they would come to an agreement, and Lugo would find some way to weasel out of it. It was obvious that these guys were never going to return a dime of their stolen booty. They were just buying time until they could find Schiller and finish him off for good. Ed was extremely frustrated. Not only was he unable to get any of the money back for his client, but he was still missing solid evidence that would put these freaks away for good. He needed a smoking gun. And it wouldn't be long before he found not just a smoking gun, but a smoking, cannon? He found a lot of evidence, is what I'm trying to say. And in the last place you'd expect, the trash. Ed was in Delgado's office waiting for him to show up so they could resume their bullshit negotiations, when the overflowing garbage can in the corner of the room caught his eye. For some reason, Ed was drawn to the wastebasket, and what he found inside was dozens of documents linking the Sun Gym members to Schiller. At that moment, Ed said, quote, "Thank God for this kind of stupidity. We might never get any of these bad guys off the streets." He might not have gotten any of Schiller's money, but Ed finally got what he needed to go to the police. This was gonna be a slam dunk case. Except, it wasn't. The police thought Schiller was completely full of shit. He was questioned for hours, pouring out all the pain and trauma he endured, but the cops weren't convinced. 3 times during the interview, Schiller was interrupted and warned that it was a crime to file a false complaint, and that the police didn't have time to pursue every nutty story that comes by. At one point, Schiller straight up asked them, "Do you think I'm making this up?" One of the officers looked him straight in the eye and said, "Yeah, we do." This was exactly what Marc Schiller feared. Dubois was absolutely dumbfounded. The cops were even more incompetent than the criminals. He warned investigators that if they didn't do something soon, the Sun Gym gang would find another victim. If only they listened. So Marc went back to Colombia with his tail between his legs. Meanwhile, the Sun Gym boys were living it up with his money. They all bought expensive houses, sports cars, and jewelry. And you know these schmucks were dropping thousands at Solid Gold almost every night. Problem is, they were going too hard. In a few short months, they had already blown through most of Schiller's money. If they were gonna keep up their lifestyle, they needed a cash injection, and they needed one soon. So the gang started prowling for its next victim. That's when Adrian Doorbal found the golden goose. Adrian was spending the night with Beatrice, one of the strippers from Solid Gold. He came across a photo in her apartment that caught his eye. She was standing in front of a gorgeous canary yellow Lamborghini. The second he laid eyes on that Lambo, he knew it had to be his. The car belonged to Beatrice's ex, Frank Griga. Griga was a big shot businessman from Hungary, and he made millions off 1-900 numbers. That's phone sex hotlines for those who don't know. Aside from the Lambo, he also owned an oceanfront mansion and a yacht. This guy was even more loaded than Schiller. That night, Adrian went to Lugo and told him that they had acquired their next target. The plot to get Griga's fortune was pretty much the same as the Schiller job. KTS. Except instead of straight up kidnapping, they would lure him into a trap, knock him out, and then transport his unconscious body to the warehouse. Lugo had obtained a buttload of horse tranquilizers to help him with the task. The two of them spent the next few days gathering intel on Griga. They found out that he was trying to branch out from the 1-900 game and invest in other businesses, which was the perfect opportunity. Lugo called Griga pretending to be a representative for a phone company that was expanding its business into India and was looking for investors. And to his credit, he made a very convincing pitch. Griga was interested. Danny invited Frank and his girlfriend Krisztina to meet him at a local steakhouse to discuss business. But when they got there, it was closed. All part of Danny's master plan. You see, the steakhouse was conveniently located right across the street from Adrian Doorbal's house, so they all went there instead. This was going much smoother than the Schiller job, so far. But from this point on, it was anything but smooth sailing. Up until now, this story has been kind of a dark comedy, but from here on out, it's a straight up horror film. Lugo, Doorbal, Krisztina, and Frank were all in the townhouse having a good time. Little drinks, little music, you know. At some point, that was a signal. Doorbal then asked Griga if the two of them could go upstairs to discuss business since it was quieter. Lugo remained in the living room with Krisztina. But pretty soon, not even the loud-ass speakers could mask the commotion coming from the second floor. It's unknown how it started, but Doorbal and Griga got into a full-on brawl. They were throwing each other into walls, breaking furniture. These guys were really going at it. Krisztina ran upstairs to see what was going on, but by the time she got up there, The commotion had ended. She looked on in horror as she saw her man lying on the floor with a pool of blood under his head. Doorbal, in a fit of rage, hit Griga over the head with a blunt object. Krisztina was screaming and started making her way downstairs towards the front door, but before she could escape, Lugo tackled her and injected her with the horse tranquilizer. Okay, so things got a little messier than expected, but hey, at least Griga was still alive. Oh. Lugo's biggest mistake was letting Doorbal take the reins on this job. The golden goose was now cooked. But not all was lost. They still had Krisztina, so at least they could use her to get inside Griga's mansion and take whatever valuables were in there. All they needed was the security code. But that wasn't going to be that easy to get. Krisztina barely spoke any English, and she was shot with enough horse tranquilizer to kill a small donkey.
Tell us the fucking numbers! What are the numbers?
Lugo screamed at her. Took a while, but eventually Krisztina rattled off some numbers. Doorbal stayed behind with her while Lugo went to Griga's house to try the numbers. He punched them in, but no dice. After exhausting every combination he could think of, Lugo called Doorbal so he could get the right code. Adrian went to check on her and replied, "Oh man, the bitch is cold. What a mess." But there was no time to dwell on mistakes. They had 2 bodies to dispose of. This is when Jorge Delgado came back into the fold. He helped the gang transport the bodies to his warehouse, the same one that Schiller was tortured in. Doorbal volunteered to cut up the bodies himself. In fact, the psycho was excited to do it. I guess he got a taste for blood. He went to the local Home Depot to purchase a gas-powered chainsaw, but the 2 geniuses couldn't figure out how to work it. So after about an hour, they gave up and decided to go old school with a hatchet. From here, it gets extremely graphic and disturbing, and there's no way I can talk about it on YouTube. If you want the full gory details, go check out my Patreon. There's also a lot of other stuff I cut out that is still in the Patreon version. So I'm going to skip past all the chopping and the butchering and the barbecuing. Several disturbing hours later. Man, these guys were really some sick f***s. After all that nasty business was out of the way, the body parts were placed in large barrels and dumped in a swamp up in the Everglades. Next, they had to get rid of Griga's Lambo. The thing attracted too much attention. It was ironic. Just days before, these men were willing to kill for this car. Now, they were dumping it like some piece of trash. By the time the bodies were disposed of, Frank and Krisztina had been missing for just under a day, and police were already receiving several calls reporting them missing. You see, despite Frank's unsavory line of work, he was by all accounts a great guy. Everybody loved him and Krisztina. Just like with Schiller, the cops brushed off most people's concerns. They were dealing with a mountain of cases and didn't have time to look into some playboy smut peddler who was probably out partying too late or something. It was only after a police officer came across Griga's abandoned Lambo that they started taking the disappearance seriously. After following up with Griga's friends, the police found out that he was last seen with 2 bodybuilders from Sun Gym. It was at that moment that Miami PD realized they fucked up. By this point, it had been 6 weeks since Marc Schiller got laughed out of the police station. Now, the tables had turned. Not only did they believe him, they needed him. Investigators needed warrants to raid the gang members' homes, but they couldn't get those without probable cause. Marc Schiller's testimony would give them that. Schiller, feeling vindicated, immediately hopped on a flight back to Miami from Colombia. Once Schiller recounted the events again, it didn't take long for the police department to raid the homes of Lugo, Doorbal, and Delgado. And the search was fruitful. As we've come to expect, these guys are complete schlemiels, and they did a worse job at covering their tracks than my Uncle Ruben did when he slept with my ex-girlfriend. First of all, Griga's DNA was all over Doorbal's townhouse, not to mention his jewelry, driver's license, and bank documents. In less than 3 hours, police turned up a mountain of evidence linking all the Sun Gym gang members to the Griga murders and Schiller's kidnapping. It was Jover. Doorbal and Delgado were immediately taken to jail along with several other accomplices. Meanwhile, John Meese was in the middle of judging a bodybuilding competition in downtown Miami, but that didn't stop the police. He was carried away in cuffs. All that was left was Danny Lugo. Except, the mother sucker was nowhere to be found. Turns out he was all the way in the Bahamas with his Romanian girlfriend Sabina. Funny thing is, Lugo had no idea the cops were investigating him. He was only there trying to pull off another one of his schemes. Since the Griga job was so badly botched, Lugo figured he could get some of Frank's money if he sued him in Bahamian court. Since Griga wasn't alive to contest the lawsuit, Danny would win by default. Pretty sure that's Not how it works, but whatever. Now, it was time for a new plan. Lugo decided that he would flee to Romania, the perfect destination for a degenerate criminal trying to escape legal repercussions in another country. Bro was ahead of his time. But there was one issue. The putz didn't have his passport. Apparently, back then you could travel to the Bahamas with just a US birth certificate, but he needed a passport to go literally anywhere else. So Danny sent Sabina back to Miami to retrieve his passport, and then the two of them would escape to Romania together. Easy. She got back to the apartment, no problem. But when she tried to get inside, her key didn't work. Now, just to give you a short rundown on Sabina, she was, not very bright, even by Romanian standards. So when her key didn't work, this didn't arouse any suspicion, and she just went to the front office to complain. But instead of getting a key for her lock, she got locked up and they threw away the key. Sounded better in my head. She was arrested. The cops had been staking the place out for days waiting for Lugo to show up, but this was the next best thing. Sabina was taken into questioning and the cops were flabbergasted at how dumb this woman was. She was fully convinced that Daniel Lugo was in the CIA, and the reason they needed to flee the country was because he got compromised. So she refused to give him up, at least at first, but after 20 hours of interrogations, she finally broke and told the cops that Lugo was hiding out at a resort in the Bahamas. He was captured and brought back to Miami within a day. By August 1995, all of the Sun Gym gang members had been arrested. Delgado, Lugo, and Doorbal were all facing the death penalty, and they immediately started turning on each other. Delgado was the first domino to fall. When faced with the chair, his loyalty for Lugo completely disappeared. He went on to become the state's star witness, and his testimony was crucial in bringing down his old pals. For his cooperation, Delgado would end up getting 15 years in prison. John Meese also had the opportunity to take a plea deal in exchange for 9 years in the can. He decided to take his chance at trial, a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. The judge sentenced him to 56 years. As for Lugo and Doorbal, their fates were sealed when Marc Schiller took the stand as a witness. He told the jury all about the sick stuff these men made him do, about how they beat him, didn't let him use the toilet, and forced him to eat Arby's. And how did Marc Schiller get repaid for bravely reliving his trauma in front of the courtroom? Well, he was arrested. I'm not kidding. The second he walked out of the courtroom, he was put in cuffs and later sentenced to 2 years in prison. Yeah, it turns out the guy had been running some kind of Medicare fraud scam, allegedly. Man, this dude could not catch a freaking break. And on top of that, Michael Bay made him look like a complete asshole in Pain and Gain. I don't think Schiller deserved all that, but Lugo and Doorbal got exactly what they deserved. The death penalty. In their pursuit of money and material gain, Daniel Lugo and Adrian Doorbal lost everything, including their freedom. It's like the Bible says, what good is it to gain the whole world if you lose your soul? But hey, on the bright side, they've had plenty of time to lift weights in prison.